Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Catie DeMets at Renewing the Countryside, and we are glad that you're joining us for our sort of last Collective Models webinar series here, although, of course, there will be ongoing work that we'll keep you apprised of. Thanks so much for joining us today. Today we have sort of a special session. We had a number of folks who from this group who went over to the Indigenous Peoples Summit that happened a couple weeks ago, and are going to be sharing back some of their learnings from that event, and how we kind of bring that back into the work that we're doing. And then at the end, we're really going to take some time to talk together about kind of how we sustain the work and move this work of collective land models forward over time. And so we're looking forward to hearing from all of you for that portion of today's meeting. And then we'll share with you some sort of opportunities that are forming for future engagement with the group, sort of regionally and beyond. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Valentine to kind of coordinate introductions of your summit group and dive into that dialogue.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Valentine Cadieux. I am at Hamline Center for Justice and Law and was part of the contingent that went down to Omaha just a week ago or so. And many of you were on the webinar in earlier summer with Luis Marcos. He is the executive director of the Maya Economic Development Organization in Omaha, and the co-founder and CEO of Comunidad Maya Pichan Isam, which is the Maya group that has been convening these Indigenous Peoples Summits, and he is the official liaison of the Maya to the tribes. There are 4 tribes that are headquartered in Omaha, and there are 126 tribes represented, for example, in the Omaha public schools. So it was a really, really interesting place, and we were really honored to be welcomed and to be part of this day-long program. The theme of this year's program was Native Nations rebuilding, and one of the big questions was this question: how do we build Native Nations self-determination and sovereignty inside the context of a settler state? So there was other representation, of course, from Minnesota, but from our group, it was me and Gary and Naima and Lucia. And so today we thought we would start with a bit of a conversation between us, and you are all welcome to kind of join in as we will present some of our key take-back ideas and kind of invite conversation about what this means. Katie, thank you so much for sending out the reminder link from when Luis was talking about this kind of context. One piece of that I'll just say as a start is one of the ways that had connected into the themes of this group was that my economic development is working with Agrarian Trust on a roughly 300-acre parcel outside of Omaha that they want to use for collective community building, both farming and housing and other things. And part of what we learned at the summit that was super interesting is that they have a parallel project in Belize where they're building a diasporic Native Nations rebuilding effort.
So I'm hoping that each of you could share a key sort of theme or topic that stood out to you from the Indigenous Peoples Summit, or a key learning and what you're taking away.
I would like to join in. Gary Hampton, Renewing the Countryside co-manager of New Ag. I worked also with the Agrarian Trust on this series of workshops with Valentine. One of the things that really stood out to me as they were speaking and sharing this body of work was that, it stood out heavy, was you can't codify culture. but you can kind of take culture and values into the bodies of work, etc. So that was something that really stood out to me and kind of resonated when we talk about culture. We talk about kind of collectively working on the land, and in their aspect, that culture, that collective piece is within their embodiment of community and the way that they live. Um, so then it just kind of also maybe go into a space of reflection around how we try to codify culture in some of our policies and approaches. And so just kind of really gave me some reflection on, how do we look at this work? How should we go about looking at this work? And that's just something that one of the things that really stood out for me, and it just kind of jumped out to me.
I'll hop in next. Thanks, Gary. My name is Lucia Possehl, and I'm the Commons cohort facilitator and manager at Sharing Our Roots in Northfield, Minnesota. And I also organize with Commons Land and working to build a commons-based community agricultural land trust. Yeah, I was really grateful for the opportunity to go to Nebraska. And I think the biggest point that I walked away from as someone who's doing on the ground land sharing work is that we all arrive, and in that space too, like everyone arrived with an experience of displacement in some capacity, and being able to honor that as we work on these commoning projects and land-based projects is that, especially at least I know in Minnesota and in my work, there's a lot of like immigrant land projects, and how do we like talk about that and center that in the work that we do, and really building like a really foundational basis of how we relate to land before we even start engaging in these larger conversations. And then the biggest question that came to me too from that experience was, how do we build ethical economies, right? How do we build like liberatory frameworks within quite strong and oppressive systems? And it was really inspiring and exciting to hear really super concrete examples of people doing that, of tribal nations doing that, of individuals doing that, and kind of considering how we build an ethical sharing economy that actually still helps uplift people and does integrate commoning ethics and still can operate within the larger system. So that's been a conversation that I've been replaying in my brain quite a bit and would love to keep having it over time. So thanks for having me today.
Thank you, Lucia. And I think I want to linger on one of the points that you just raised right now for a moment. You mentioned some examples that really stood out to you, maybe both big and large, of these sort of ethical economies and what that looks like. Would you be willing to share, one of those examples like that really is sticking with you?
Yeah, and I'd ask Gary and Valentine to chime in with the details because they're leaving me right now. But the leader of the Iowa Nation was talking about he put a slide up of all the different enterprises that their nation has. They basically did like an assessment of like what are the how do we create the industry that we need to be sovereign. And there were like, I don't know, 20 different businesses, 20 different enterprises within their or their tribal structure that they had created for their community. And that was really inspiring to me. And also the Lakota maid owner and woman from Mankato also spoke. So it was these two really great examples, both like as a full nation and then as an individual, what it means to be building those economic or sovereign economic enterprises. Gary and Valentine, do you have other details to add there?
Yeah, I would love to just jump in specifically. So the Iowa holding company is called Gray Snow. I'm just curious, show of hands, is this something people already know about in this group? Because I had not heard anything about this. So Gray Snow is a holding company held by the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska. has 8 sub-companies, like a construction company, what is about to be the country's largest networked apiary, so selling honey and bee products. Their tribal chairman, Timothy Rod, described remarkable, I mean, he framed, this is the territory like that we had moved from. We're Great Lakes people, we were fish eaters, here were our trade networks. And he described a lot of the rebuilding of trade networks. For example, because the Missouri River is polluted, they are trading with the Pacific Northwest tribes for fish. So because fish oil was a big expense of a lot of the people in the tribe. So thinking about, they have a Center for Excellence in Regenerative Native Agriculture, a very large USDA climate ready agriculture center. So really thinking about economic development so much in the terms that we often hear communities describing here of kind of health as our first wealth, and thinking a lot about how do we move beyond economic development where money is the only metric, and to think instead of money as a tool. So for example, one of the metrics he described was energy sovereignty. So one of their holding companies has developed partnerships with a South Korean fiber optics firm, and they are spreading broadband and energy capacity through their tribal regions such that they will be energy sovereign within the next 2 years. And outside of Kansas City, they have developed a foreign trade zone where they're conducting this exchange with South Korea and with other trading partners and having manufacturing added value. So building on economic strategies that they described as coming from Ho-Chunk Inc. and helping other tribes replicate them. And there was a lot of reflection at the meeting about how just 5 years ago, the kind of economic development that was being proposed to tribes was often like, we can put this detention center, often youth detention centers, so incredibly injurious forms of economic development. And they were saying, instead, how important it is to have metrics like energy sovereignty and food sovereignty, and those being actually achievable in these, very short-term periods of time, instead of being reliant on something like incarceration to be a form of economic development. So that was really powerful.
I just want to double down on the which really connects to other bodies of work that I'm connected with is the trade efforts, the intentionality of it, the not the theory of it, but they're actually practicing it. They're actually putting it to work. So I feel like it's something we could really learn from within the cooperative spaces and agricultural spaces as we go about doing this work. But it was really impressive what Gray Snow is doing and has done, and how they're actually focusing on not the problems but sovereign solutions. Is something that really stood out. So I just wanted to share an uplift. And Valentine, great explanation of that dynamic. So I appreciate that.
Excellent. Thank you all. Any other key themes that you wanted to share about? I know policy and sort of nation rebuilding had come up as themes, which probably feel related to trade efforts that you were just describing, but certainly open to other thoughts there.
I just want to reinforce one other thing that Gary and Lucia both mentioned, about policy specifically. And I thought this reflects back, I think, on many of the discussions we've been having in the last year, but from a more Indigenous centered way. Part of what seemed really important was the network building. So the panelists included Indigenous leaders from a really large set of regions, really kind of building up networked relationships, in addition to legislators and people from the civil society sector. And this idea that Gary mentioned, Misty Slater, excuse me, also from the Iowa tribe, who's their chief of staff, has really been working on a series of building up policies to support cultural values, and this idea that you can't legislate or codify culture, but that you can create policies that support values, especially values that you constantly find are compromised when you have to default to existing rules that don't respect the cultural values you have. It just, I know I am a policy geek, as many of you know, but it really reinforced the sense of the value of dragging the rest of your community into some of the details of this, to be able to build up the supportive infrastructure so that your defaults aren't always the wrong defaults, so that the status quo isn't reproducing harm. So just really straightforward examples. She was describing the handling of animals and the meat packing, like, constantly having to default to the standards of USDA packing plants for the way that animals are treated, which is then creates a moral injury to people who don't think animals should be treated that way, or for whom it's not part of the cultural respect to animals. Just, one of the ways that we change that is by creating an alternate set of standards, and so that you're not stuck just with one standard because yours isn't represented in the rules. And again and again across different domains that came up of kind of helping to build the new rules. So I feel like part of what was really heartening to see, and to see that we are already in many of our social networks plugged into this conversation, was that people who are Indigenous here and elsewhere, and also people who come from community-centered traditions, who may not identify as Indigenous, but who have those values that are in contrast to the very individualized idea of land being owned and extracted from, can band together to create those different kinds of frameworks that allow success to be defined differently and defined collectively. And I will just note, for those who didn't see, I put the link to the program. So it was quite dense. It was mostly a program within one day, although the evening before there was kind of a welcome and get to know. And then on the morning after, there was a kind of tribal leadership next steps conversation. And the one that, while I'm still unmuted, I will say one of the conversations that came up that we were part of was that next year, I think there's an interest in trying to have it be somewhat more intentionally intergenerational. There was just so much commentary during the meeting that this is something that having more youth, there was some youth representation, especially Sarah Hansen, who's an Anishinaabe youth advocate with the UN, working with the Conference on the Parties for youth engagement around climate questions from an Indigenous perspective. But it just struck me this so plugs in to a lot of work that happens in our regions that often is quite youth-centered. And so we have noted that there is a SARE youth education grant that is due in November. So I kind of want to plant the seed as we get to further conversation about whether folks might be interested, if you work with communities of youth that would want to go back to an event like this when it happens next year. We'd love to be in touch about that.
Yeah, I just want to add one more thing around the culture piece and codifying. One of the things that also stood out was you can take the values into the business and the economics, but is also as making it inclusive of the indigenous laws. And so in the practices. So I just wanted to there's this stronger piece holding together this sovereignty work, and I think that's also part of it. And then something else that stood out to me as well as we continue the conversation that has direct relations to this was the statement around land back being part of as farm recession and reparations. So as individuals are aging out, what does that look like for land back, and that being part of that succession strategy to return lands? So that was something that also stood out to me, and really seems realistic and viable, just about policy and change and the right champions, I believe. But that's all I want to add on that. Katie?
Thanks, Gary. It looks like Lucia's rejoining us right now. I appreciate that. So I guess as you started to bring up the collective land piece, you know, we had a question here about how do you each see the themes that you're talking about here reflected sort of in your own work and projects, and how do these insights invite us back into this work together? Any thoughts there?
I think part of it is intentionality, just in how we go about doing it, and maybe even rethinking some of our thought processes around how we engage different cultures, different individuals, and kind of being open to centering some of the decision making and different things more within the communities. And that way is it may come out and show more reflective of those communities and how they connect with the land. So that can change. And I know it can be challenging in different dynamics, having different cultures or cross-cultural stewards or individuals working the lands, et cetera. But I just think just really being intentional. And I think that's something that we can learn from the Indigenous Peoples Summit, the intentionality around the way they're building sovereignty and also economic solutions that really are applicable probably across the rural and urban spaces when we're looking at the disparities and challenges that folks are experiencing and the different injustices that also intersect and overlap as you know they try to survive in the day-to-day. So I think there's a lot to take away from that and being intentional in how we go about doing this body of work and continuing to work as we engage and work across cultures and communities, et cetera. And I think we see that, you know, each of us we have different relationships with the land, even though we may show up in the same spaces, but that care and that relationship is also going to be somewhat more individualized and can be reflected and look differently, especially when you have bodies of culturally connected individuals. So I just want to bring insight to the intentionality of what we do going forward.
Thank you, Gary. I love that. Lucia, did you want to jump in here with any thoughts related or your own?
Yeah, I think I echo a lot of what Gary shared, and it's just a good reminder to me of like this working group and all the learning that has happened here, like having an annual gathering, right, of people who are doing this work in all different land contexts and cultural contexts to be able to have discussion, because it was a really, you know, it's really challenging work in a lot of ways, and a lot of folks are fighting against pretty big systems to build different worlds. And so I think that in terms of like how do we integrate this moving forward, to me it's like the practice of an annual gathering, right, and you know, having a handful of panelists and conversations and at different scales and cultures and in different landscapes to come together, because it felt re-energizing in a way. And I know in conversation with Naima, who was also there, you know, we both came into it being like, wow, there's so much going on in our worlds, and there's a lot of overwhelm right now, and leaving it feeling really inspired and grounded in the work that we're engaging with. So in addition to all those learnings, the importance of coming together and learning from one another.
Thanks, Lucia. And maybe this is a good opportunity to invite Naima into the conversation. I think she's just able to join us now. Naima, if you have anything you want to share about your takeaways from the summit, or what takeaways you're bringing back into your own work and projects, I think that would be great.
Thank you, everyone. And I was just about to second that and echo what was said as well. I think relationship is important in how we connect with the land and each other. I think recognizing that we are a guest here, like one of the speakers mentioned, that, you know, the theme was, for non-natives to understand where they are, and language matters, and how we approach communities. And for me, my takeaway was, this is really familiar to me in terms of how the relationship that we have with the land, and the relationship that we have as a community, and how we share that space, and how we are connected. So it was refreshing to see that. And actually, my cup was really empty, and I left being full, and just a lot of gratitude. And just really, the timing was just perfect for me, even though I was really exhausted and I had to step away from the farm. But that summit really left me thinking deeper in terms of my interaction with the land too. And now that I'm a quote unquote landowner, I still feel weird about that, and weird saying it, even though, I feel like I'm a guest here. Um, I don't know, it was just so much to take away and so much to unpack, as business as usual, just like resume back to being busy, right? And so we're trying to create a culture where, we want to slow down and have that deep connection, and just have that deep relationship with this land that obviously, my ancestors are not from, and have that connection, and preserve it um with respect, and just acknowledging, you know, what's front of me, and so there's just a lot to discuss here, but I always leave room for growth and further conversation. Hopefully this is not the end, but that summit was really, it transformed a lot for me. So I'm glad that I attended. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Naima. I wonder whether you and Lucia, as land stewards, might be willing to share a little bit more about, like, is there a daily practice that you're kind of bringing back to your daily interactions with the land coming out of the summit, or just some way of thinking about it that feels sort of meaningful on that just day-to-day level?
Short and simple. When I wake up, I do we walk around the property, and I just remind myself, how do I hold myself accountable now that I'm a landowner, now that, we're stewarding this land that I'm getting to know every day. Just the responsibility, and like the stewardship of, how am I showing up every day? I don't want to extract like my fellow neighbors who are doing corn and soybean, nothing against them, but the reality is, like, how do I showcase, like, there's more to it, and I feel like just having that engagement with the community as I'm getting to know the community here, and also inviting the community in the urban setting, because I do serve the urban setting. We have an urban farm in South Minneapolis where we grow a lot of food for the elders. So there's just so much happening on my end that I'm always questioning, am I doing the right thing by implementing this practice? Who do I need to reach out to that are not only the experts, but also that are the true, knowledge holders that know more about this land than me. And that's just the journey that I'm going through right now, just really making those connections, so that that I'm not causing further harm, that I'm actually doing right by the land, and the community that have been here before me. So I hope that makes sense.
Thanks, Naima. Yeah, it's a really good question, Katie. One of the notes that I took from one of the speakers, they talked about what it means to touch the land that you came from. And on the land that I steward with 40 some farmers, many of us don't have the opportunity to be on the land where we come from. And what does it mean to, like, build a collective practice of being of this farm or of this space, and building a relationship with it. And when we came back, we've been planning a harvest celebration in which we had dancers and elders and community members from all the different farming communities that are here at Sharing Our Roots to be able to, like, honor the harvest. And I've talked with Valentine about this a little bit, like even with the word commons, we've spent a lot of time of like in your language and culture, what does that mean? Like, what is the word in your language that actually means commons, and how do we like come up with a shared definition of that that's relevant to our place and our community? And so I think that coming off of the trip to Nebraska and then hosting this huge harvest celebration in which we were all bringing our practices and connection to the land together, I think it was just like a good reminder of like we are actively building culture in relationship to the land, and being aware that that's like an evolving process. I think has been really important. Yeah, that's what I have. It's a slow emergent thing.
Can I add something real quick to what Lucia was saying, and what does commons mean, like in your language, culture, etc. And this takes me back to the National Sustainability Society conference, and I'm connecting back. I'm hoping to get more of this information, but it was it spoke to commenting, but then also spoke of this translanguaging or translanguaging and kind of biocultural dialogue to kind of show and speak to what you're saying about working on the land across cultures, et cetera, and what does this expression mean over here. And so is like I find that was something that was being very well heavily discussed, and a challenge and a solution. So I think being able to embrace those things, and as you spoke to, Lucia, is a challenge, but it's necessary, and I think that's part of that kind of reframing how we work in communities and across communities, not just say one size fits all, and this definition is what the definition is, because that word or meaning may show up, like you said, may show up differently based on language, culture, or their connections with the lands in which they've come from, as we figure out how to connect and build culture and community here continuously here in America, So thank you.
I'd also love to kind of add one more reflection as a land steward. I feel like this theme that many of you just reflected on coming back and noticing like where we can better center relationship in our own land stewardship journeys is an interesting one. And here at Hamline, we have a micro farm that is now one of the USDA People's Gardens. And since its beginning, really, I think one of the main efforts has been to try to center the honorable harvest, and to, especially, there's just so many mechanics. You're harvesting, you're trying to make sure the right people get food, to remember to be grateful and to remain rooted in relationality. But something that didn't occur to me until we talked to the students' garden actually at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, where this was housed. And it was a student org that stewards their garden. And it was a really interesting moment, because the week I came back, the students here were like, why is this not a student organization? We could have a student organization, which we're now in the process. Like, it had just never occurred to me what the collective strategies were to hold lands, say, in each social grouping where I am. So I've been really excited this week to see the Farmland Access listserv, kind of like some discussion of like, what are the existing grouping mechanisms that we already have, and can we use those for farming? I also just have a couple key quotes that I had written down that I thought were really part of our relevance. One was, one of the situating statistics that was shared was, because of the various relocation acts, that 71% of Indigenous people of North American Indigenous people are in cities in the US. And that reinforced the focus on metro agriculture as for its inclusiveness and for its kind of civil rights dynamics. And part of the definition of sovereignty that was being used was the need to repair both colonial and neo-colonial appropriation and underdevelopment. So I think just that constantly holding the line that like the development language that we have been steeped in is so often one of of really strategic underdevelopment and appropriation, and being aware of that. And then the final, where we left off at the end of the day was around this question. A lot of people kept raising the question around land return of sacred lands. And there was this reinforcement that sacred lands have been a strategy, but that all land is sacred. And the injunction was to sing a song that catches everyone's heart so that they realize it's all sacred. And that came from the executive director of the Blue Heron organization. And I am trying to find his name. I'll put it in the chat so I'm not picking up more time.
Thank you, Valentine, and everyone. At this point, I'll say that if anyone has any questions, feel free to place them in the chat. You're also welcome to unmute yourself and ask. I feel like this has been a really rich conversation, so maybe we covered all the questions, although it's big and lots to talk about. Okay, and I'll just raise up an earlier chat comment from Stephen Carpenter. There are some webinars that might be of interest coming through FLAG on Minnesota lending law and farm leases, and discussion of discrimination law and some recent changes in FSA farm lending programs. And he put the link in the chat if you're interested in that. Excellent. Thank you, everyone, for sharing these experiences. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure the group does as well. I'm getting some gratitude in the chat. I think at this point, Valentine, if you don't mind, I'll turn it over to you to sort of set up our breakout room activity here.
So as you hopefully saw in the invitation, and thank you, Katie, for your awesome invitations. What we are hoping to do at the middle section today is to have breakout conversations of folks who can talk a bit about where the continuing work is. So if you are in a geographic region where you would like other people to join in, or if you have an opportunity that's moving forward where you think some of this collective farmland tenure and related work is going, we thought this would be a good time for that. Now, we are a small enough group that I will just say what we had said we would do next is have a closing circle where we kind of hear from everybody reporting back from that group. So if people would rather not go into breakout rooms, I think with fewer than 20 people, we could just go right into that circle. If people have put some work into having like a conversation about their initiatives, we'd like to make space for it, whether that's all together or broken out. So maybe let's take a moment to kind of get a pulse of the room. Do people have a sense of, like, for example, if there are folks from the Wisconsin policy group and they're like, we really would love to make sure all the Wisconsin people could get together and like know what our next steps are. This would be a great time to speak up.
As a member of the Wisconsin policy group, I feel like there are so many cross-cutting themes today that I guess my instinct would be to keep us all in the same room for now to do some sharing.
Great. I see nods on that and affirmation in the chat. So that would be awesome. Fabulous. That's also much easier for people to get access to from the recordings later because it's hard to record breakout rooms. So fabulous. So really what we'd love to do is kind of the theme that I just said. What we would love to do, because we've heard from some folks and we haven't necessarily heard from everyone. So kind of in the spirit of a closing circle, because we've had this wonderful journey together over the last year or so. So especially if you know you're going to have to leave early, if you'd like to just kind of introduce yourself. And if you don't know of any continuing places of this work, if there's anything you want to say about like kind of where you hope it goes forward or where you would like to be able to connect with folks again. For example, a bunch of us have been trying to pin down dates or at least have a placeholder to share with you all about some field days that are going up and chances to connect in person. But also, for example, ongoing things like, for example, the food group really wanted us to mention the ongoing efforts for solar farming, where there are opportunities for people to do vegetable and livestock farming around solar farms that appear to be being piloted really successfully and likely to expand. So I think it's a little messy, but I think maybe if we're a small enough group that if people want to just maybe raise hands and we can create a stack. So if you want to raise your virtual or real hand, and we can maybe call on folks to go next. And if you
And so just to clarify the ask, Valentine, it's kind of like if you're involved with a collective land effort or interested in being involved, feel free to share about that. Or if there's some particular area of need related to collective land, we'd love to hear about that as we think about how do we, continue moving the work forward in this space.
Exactly. And in addition, if you are a person that we just haven't heard from yet, we would love to know who you are before we close our year-long kind of conversations with each other. So feel free also just to introduce yourself and kind of your area of the space. Colleen.
Hi, yeah. So I actually found the Zoom meeting through the Queer Farmer Network listserv. It's funny because I see some familiar faces that I met at the Indigenous Peoples Summit, and my intention in joining was to learn about land access models, and help share that out more nationally with people who are struggling with secure land tenure. So a little bit about me, I work with incubator apprenticeships and agricultural collaborations, or ag clusters, is some of the terminology that we've used. And so it's a big community of practice thinking about how to support a next generation of farmers. And I was brought on to really focus on the land access piece and just different models and how it can be shared regionally and nationally. So yeah, the Indigenous Peoples Summit was amazing, and it was very great to hear all of your reflections and great to meet you all there in person. And I guess I'm looking forward to seeing what continued work this group does and how other working groups across the country can learn from it. And I can shoot an email to the Google group listserv. Helen, I just saw your chat. But yeah, I want to learn from the work you're doing, and then also create a listserv to share out different models so we can all learn together and learn from one another. And this work is in partnership with Agrarian Commons, so it's kind of like the link here. Or Agrarian Trust, sorry, and we're working with the Agrarian Commons. Agrarian Trust is creating, so that's one model, is like the nonprofit land holding model, and how does that work in different places?
Thanks, Colleen. I'd like to hear your kind of experience with the Indigenous Peoples Summit since you were there with us, and if you could give some reflection back as well.
Yeah, I think it was really inspirational to learn from all of the coalition building happening. And it was my first time in Omaha. And so learning that they have the highest per capita refugee population, and thinking about the coalition building between dispossessed peoples and native peoples was just, inspirational to learn about. One thing that I really walked away with was thinking about stakeholders versus right bearers. So that really stuck with me, and thinking about the struggles of, how this rogue form of neoliberal capitalism, as someone stated, how it impacts all of us, right? And how when people are dislocated from their homes, as a large population of Mayan sovereign peoples were in Omaha, when you're not recognized as a nation, then you can't have your own governance. And so like really mulling over that, I've been reflecting on it a lot and thinking about how we can change policy in the US to recognize sovereign nations of people who our crimes as a country have dislocated from their native lands. So yeah, that's probably like my big reflection.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Might you be willing to say a little bit about what the Wisconsin Policy Group is doing? Because I know we have had quite a lot, even if today isn't the biggest day of Wisconsin presence, we have some of our awesome Wisconsin folks or others who are part of that.
Yeah, you know, I'm a little bit new to that group, so I'm not sure I can share much. I might bat that over to Mia if she's been involved with that group. She has not. Okay.
No, I have not. I've been more involved with some other efforts, but I think they're really moving forward. And I think the person that's pretty much spearheading that is Angie Doucette, I think.
Yep, from American Farmland.
American Farmland. Yep.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how that work has quite intersected with the collective models piece. But I do know that I think the Wisconsin Policy Group in general is working really hard to get the beginning farmer tax credit program underway and develop some sort of stronger policies around supporting more diversified agriculture and supporting small scale and historically underserved producers. So I think those are some of the top priorities for the group.
Yeah, I can put in the chat box, Katie, some areas that came out of the in-person meeting we had in August from the Farmland Access Hub, Wisconsin people. So there's some kind of like emerging themes out of that whole day together. And I can put those in the chat box if that would help kind of spur some discussion and ideas.
Thanks, Mia. And Mia,
it's missing an I in the beginning there. Increasing public awareness. Yeah, so some of these things I'm personally very passionate about. I'm in the Appleton area in Wisconsin, and so some things that came out was increasing just public awareness in general of farmland access and transfer issues, how we can create an effective farmlink program in Wisconsin, looking maybe at best practices elsewhere. How do we create welcoming and inclusive rural communities? There's a workshop on October 1st that Marble Seed is putting on, and New Thou is starting an allyship network. I'm going to that training, hope to see folks there. And then policy, that's the policy working group. And then another big theme came out, which was the engaging local government, including planning and zoning, because at the end of the day, a lot of our communities have very localized zoning ordinances, and there may be barriers to more collective land access models. And so that's another idea for a potential kind of working group that at least Wisconsin folks would be interested in.
Fabulous, thank you.
Stephen would love to hear about Farm Aid if you want to share.
Sure, I'll keep it super brief. So Farm Aid, you may know, is sort of a charitable organization, and the money comes from an annual concert. This is Lloyd Nelson and Neil Young and that crew. And so every year they have a festival, and this year was near Albany, New York. And it's not just a big long concert. It's a full day of farmer forum activities that they describe with panels, and then a day before that there are always farm tours and other efforts. And so Farm Aid, if you are developing a grassroots farm organization, I would encourage you to think about seeking funding from Farm Aid. You can go look at their website, and you can sort of see the sort of folks that they are interested in supporting. It's also sort of somewhat similar to the folks that were able to go to Omaha. It's just great to hang out with people who care about some of the same stuff and are fighting back. And it's always great to be with people that are fighting back. I'll repeat that. And the thing that I think is in particular relevant for this group is that you continue to see a sort of a building of interest and curiosity about alternative land ownership models. And so there were people kind of from all over, you know, that where things like you know, mention of new communities and, you know, sort of various alternatives just pop up. And so I found that interesting. You know, there's, as we know, you know, most people are hoping, trying to get some land tenure to farm themselves, but there are people interested in all kinds of degrees of sort of cooperative effort. And the really important, I think, thing that was brought up over and over by grassroots organizations and farmers was shared interests of rural and urban farmers and people who want to farm. And, you know, the issues are very similar, and the solidarity is incredibly important. And so be happy to talk, you know, if somebody is interested in trying to get funding from them, I'm happy to talk to you. I kind of know those folks, and actually they helped found FLAG, Farmers Legal Action Group. Willie Nelson wrote a check after the first Farm Aid concert that allowed the creation of Farmers Legal Action Group in 1985. So that's my report. I actually kind of have to roll here in just a minute. I've got another call, but that's Farm Aid. And Willie Nelson always does, you know, Willie's out there, he's doing it. So it's always kind of funny and great in its own way. So that's my report.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in? Any collective land related thoughts, initiatives?
I just want to touch something Stephen mentioned, that urban to rural braiding, similar problems and issues. So I think it's very important as we're doing this work, we're looking at land access succession solutions, but also as we're looking at like food systems as one of those interconnecting bodies of work that could possibly kind of help hold and connect and continue to bring kind of this awareness and building the curiosity that Stephen was speaking of. So I think that's an important piece that sometimes gets pitted against each other when we should be really looking at those intersections and interlocking shared solutions. So thank you, Stephen.
Such a great point, Gary. Thanks. It looked like maybe Lauren, you were getting ready to share.
Hi. Yeah, I also just wanted to, I guess I got plugged into this. This is my first time joining from the Queer Farmer Network. And my interest in collective farming models is definitely personal. Having farmed for the last decade and running my own farm for the last 4 years, and having essentially lost my farm this June, and knowing I want to farm and that I will, but going forward wanting to do it differently and collectively. And then sort of like processing my own grief, also realizing this is much larger than just my farm and myself. So yeah, I haven't had an opportunity to listen. I wasn't at the Indigenous Summit, and I look forward to listen to the links that you shared. But yeah, just a belief in our ability to collectively provide for each other, and how farming plays a role in that, and wanting that to be, wanting the future of my farm to be rooted in that, and wanting to share that with other people, knowing I can't do it all by myself, not wanting to. Yeah, that's why I'm here.
Thank you, Lauren. Appreciate you sharing that story and some of your concerns. I think that's super well aligned. And sorry that we didn't connect with the Queer Farmer Network earlier, but looking forward to future opportunities for connection there. Other thoughts? Anyone want to chime in? Kelly, I know you're.
I can chime in.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry,
please.
I'm on the phone, so I can't read the room at all. My name's Hannah Breckville. I'm in rural Northeast Iowa, and I farm with Humble Hands Harvest, which is a worker-owned co-op farm. So we've been farming as such for, I guess this is our 8th season. So we've got a little experience with a different way of doing things, but what the project that I'm really excited about moving forward is just within my local community, not forming a land trust and not forming, it's not a nonprofit model, but it's a cooperative model of land holding. So we're gathering community members to join a cooperative farm. It's called the Farmers Land Investment Co-op. So people are pooling their money to be able to buy farmland that can be used for community purposes. And right now it's just a vision. We don't have anything concrete other than 35 members. But I feel really excited about the possibilities going forward with getting an entire community of people in a rural place involved in what happens on the land, and involved in supporting whatever farming enterprises are happening, or supporting whatever ecological regeneration happenings are happening on the land. So anyway, that's my reporting on what I'm thinking about going forward, and I'd love to figure out how to better incorporate Native voices also into the decision making and the thought process around what happens to land in our local community. So that's my report.
Awesome, thank you. And are you entirely people in Iowa at this point? Just like, how local?
We so far are accepting members in any state. We might not be able to accept investments from out of state, but we can accept members from out of state. So
awesome.
Yep.
Glad I asked.
Yeah.
And Hannah, could I also ask, who are your members? Are they mostly those interested in farming, or do they span a broad sort of community spectrum?
No, yeah, they're definitely a broad community spectrum, and the point is to be a broad community that's supporting farmland rather than just the burden of figuring out how to finance farmland being on just the farmers. And yeah. It's really cool because it's a very intergenerational group. There are people in their 20s, there are people in their 80s who are part of it. So
awesome. Thank you, Hannah. That's really exciting. Anyone want to jump in with any questions for Hannah or anything here?
Yeah, I have a quick question. Loving the hearing co-ops in this conversation as well. So are you working with any type of like technical assistance or like cooperative development centers to help you frame out this approach, or to help give you guidance or access to resources or anything of that nature?
Yeah, totally. We've been, I mean, I personally have been in communication with people at the University of Wisconsin for sure. And then we've just used a lot of support, both for my own farm and also for this new investment co-op, from the Sustainable Economies Law Center and from other real estate investment co-ops that have made their documents public to be modified and adapted to other purposes. So yeah, we've been gathering resources for sure.
Okay. I just wanted to know, make sure you had access to some things, and if I could have supported you with sharing additional information, etc.
Cool.
Hannah, I know we've talked, this is Kelly Maynard. from Center for Co-ops. So I know we've talked, of course, about Humble Hands and various things and the new enterprise. And I know, I mean, this has come up because in other conversations I've talked about, you know, working on a guide about cooperative using the co-op model for purchasing farmland. And I know that this was a consideration when you formed Humble Hands Harvest, like you incorporated as an LLC because there was the concern about you know, the legal structure of the entity and like corporate ownership of farmland laws. And so I'm curious, with the new entity, is it incorporated under one of Iowa's co-op statutes? And how did you how are you envisioning kind of working in that context? And I know every state has different laws in this regard. So
yeah, the Farmers Land Investment Co-op is incorporated as a cooperative.
Great.
Under Iowa law. And yeah, the only reason that Humble Hands isn't incorporated as a cooperative is that you need 5 members under Iowa law to have one. And we only have 2 worker owners right now. So yeah, but yeah, we're a co-op.
Great. And do you foresee challenges with those corporate laws, or is it just, I mean,
all of the lawyers that we've talked to in Iowa have not expressed concern about that.
And that's how the lawyers I've talked to in Wisconsin have said, like, in theory, there are these laws. They're not blanket, you know, prohibitions, and they also are largely unenforced. So it's like, okay. So we know there are plenty of corporations that own farmland. Anyway, so yeah. Great. I'm glad that you're hearing that too. So
awesome. And for those of you who might not know, Kelly joined us for a session on cooperatives as they relate to collective land efforts a couple of months ago, and is an awesome resource. Thanks for being here today, Kelly. Others, I'm going to circle back to what some of the things that Mia mentioned in the chat, but I want to make space for those who haven't spoken yet. Anyone else want to share? Mia, can I circle back to you to sort of share about the various things you put in the chat?
Yeah, I littered up the chat box a little bit. Just a couple of training opportunities. The Welcoming Communities, the allyship training is on October 1st. There's a link there. The FEED Summit is a Food Entrepreneurial Ecosystem Development Summit that Extension is putting on every year. It's going to be in Milwaukee this year. So it's just cheap promo. But the one big ask I put in the chat is that I'm already working with some local groups that are accessing land more collectively or cooperatively, specifically the Northeast Wisconsin Hmong Professionals Organization, and another organization out of Appleton. But my idea is to kind of speak to more community groups that are linked to either community gardens, market gardens, food access work, culturally responsive programs, and also speak to landowners like public lands, so local government, etc., congregations, private landowners, educational institutions, nonprofits. The list goes on, to figure out how to tentatively map out some possibilities for expanded land access. So if anybody's done something like this, I would love to learn from you. I said I want to reinvent the wheel. If you have a nice template or idea of like, this worked, this didn't work, because I know this could be a big snowball effect. And so, yeah, would love to speak to you if you have ideas.
Thanks, Mia. I feel like I'm sensing a lull in the conversation, but if there are any other thoughts that people want to share before we do some sort of closing, definitely we welcome them.
I just wanted to ask if anyone wanted to speak either to upcoming events. I know the Metro Food Justice Network has some upcoming events, and there are upcoming field days with connectors. I know these are more Minnesota focused. I will just say, as a space for the connectors, so Renewing the Countryside has been one of the parallel projects to the working groups, has been a network of people helping to connect, particularly to USDA and other resources supporting farmers. And a lot of those connectors have been finding that people want to farm collectively. And this kind of goes back, Colleen, I really appreciate some of the points you brought back from the Indigenous Peoples Summit, because that contrast between stakeholders and rights bearers, like one of the things that really struck me as important in the way we all work is the habitual, like people using Indigenous partners to access programs, to access resources without their best interests in mind. And a piece of what I've really appreciated about the connectors work is that it has taken an effort of the USDA to try to kind of like connect people to centralized resources, and it is doing like this translational work, trying to actually like provide feedback to the USDA about how its programs could act differently. So I just, especially for those who are connected to connectors, and will send out these future opportunities, but the work that they've been doing has just been so heart nourishing. I feel like it's the thing that comes closest to the nourishment I felt at the Indigenous Peoples Summit, or the gatherings of connectors. And they have been doing field days. And the next one in the metro area that I know of is October 21st in the evening at Frogtown Farm. So I know that's a little far for folks, but I will also note we're working on another in-person gathering at Naima's farm in Minneapolis, the Somali American Farmers Association, a meal in the spring, probably May-ish. So we'll send out to the list an opportunity to sign up for that. And part of what we'd love is if you're a bit out of the metro, but you'd like to come and join one of those, we have some funding kind of at the closing at the end of this network to give people travel stipends, but we need to figure it out like this week because this budget is closing. So if you know you might like to do that, we would love to like get you a stipend to be able to connect in person for one of those field days. And I know there's one more field day coming up that will be with Urban Roots and the contingent from the National Urban Ag Initiative from here that went to the launch in Detroit this summer. And that will be hosted by the East Phillips Neighborhood Association and the whole kind of Roof Depot Urban Ag community development site, like looking ahead to the infrastructure to build that. So those are just some upcoming opportunities to meet up actually on the land, but I realize they're not super close to some of you.
I'll chime in too, Valentine, and mention one more opportunity. Valentine and Gary and I recently connected with the Wisconsin Farmers Union, who has been hearing from their members a lot about interest in collective farming, and so some intersections there. And they're going to do, I think it's sort of a podcast and case study series starting this fall around some different aspects of collective models. So there will be some more resources available related to that as well. So we'll make sure to be sharing those out.
Yeah, I'm speaking at those, and my colleague Kristen. We're not the only speakers, but we're some of them. So I know the webinar is on October 16th. And then there's going to be a series of interviews that will be, I think, pre-recorded and put online, put on YouTube, maybe.
Perfect. Thanks, Kelly. If you want to share that link with me, I can make sure to get it out to the group.
Yeah, I don't know if they have it quite yet, but hopefully soon because it's coming up.
Great. Cool.
And I saw that Lucia had to hop off, so I will just say, because I don't think anyone else is here from Commons Land, but the group that started the SARE part of this webinar series, the Commons Land, that was the Minnesota version of the Agrarian Commons here, is continuing to work and I think welcomes engagement. And they have clusters working with the Anishinaabe Ag Institute in the northern part of the state with Sharing Our Roots and some other farms in the southeastern area of the state and in metro work. And they have been working also with the Midwest Farmers of Color Collective to build up their land fund. So that's for folks interested. I think that's going to be one of the areas, especially kind of Minnesota, Western Wisconsin focused, of continued work on building resources for farming together. And was anyone here who knows anything else about the solar farming? I mentioned that earlier, but I don't know how people could get involved with that. But I know there's an upcoming field day.
It's been rescheduled for October 10th, I think. I should double check on that. And I would just, yeah, I can put something in the chat. See if I can find that info. One sec.
Thank you so much, Katie. I will just say I was talking to Sarah Wuta last week about it, and part of what's awesome, just kind of planting the seed, is that the solar companies are looking for farmers for at least 10 years. Like, they're looking for long-term free contracts. So they're allowing people to farm without lease fees. But it's kind of a research and development, like trying to figure out what works farming around solar panels. Like, probably many of you have heard goats don't work because they climb on the solar panels and eat the electronics. But there's like big money coming out from the IRA trying to figure out if cattle work in these areas. Like, it's an area that I think is both useful for its source of land, but it's also useful. I'm hoping that we can use it to say, hey, look, this works really well. Departments of transportation in our states and departments of natural resources and other big public landholders. Like, how about you also create some 10-year, really low cost leases? So, and yeah, Friendly, just see your note. I put the link in the chat. That's the playlist for all the previous sessions. And part of what maybe we can do is kind of in our wrapping up is we can send that out to folks, and we could have are you willing to have your name shared on the list? I feel like we probably need consent before we share people's contact information, but my guess is a lot of people would like to stay in touch. And one last thing I'll say about it is, when we first started this, I was applying for continuing education credit for like legal education. If there are things that you or your communities would like done with this footage, like if you'd like it turned into another presentation or, you know, a highlights list with particular themes, please let us know, because we are building a website that kind of has shorter versions of some of these with some of the highlights, and we would love to make it useful to you or your communities. So.
Awesome. Thank you, Valentine. Gratitude for everything going on in the chat. And so I think with that, Kelly, did you have something you wanted to
I had
add?
one. I think one of the first calls I joined, which I think I joined the party mid party, but there had been conversation about like creating a written resource that like can summarize different models, or and then we embarked on this series of inviting people in. Is there still people thinking about that, or is that is that a work in progress under other projects? Or yeah, just curious about that.
Could you say a little bit more specifically about the written resource? Because I know two of the written resources that had been proposed were, one was kind of like an introduction to farming that doesn't look like commodity farming, and the other was a checklist of like helping to negotiate the relationship between a landholder and a farmer.
Yeah, from what I'm remembering, I don't know, and maybe me, like it was like a summary of the different types of collective models in use for accessing farmland.
Yes.
That was, like different chapters on different things. And that was when I shared, like, Mia and I are working on a written thing that was just about the co-op model. But
that's how I remember it too, like being more of an umbrella resource about collective models, like just what this group has been all about for the last year and all the learnings we've done, and being able to kind of put out maybe a master resource or something that would have potentially different focus areas, like what you said, Valentine or Kelly. Yeah, case studies that provide real examples. Could also include potentially local zoning, planning and zoning, but of course that would differ between the states and everything. But anyways, that's how I remember too, like a few months back us talking about that might be a an outcome for everybody to kind of like maybe tap into. Maybe there would be another grant that we would apply for, etc.
Yeah, I feel like we got some of that started and we didn't get that far in it. So I like that idea that maybe that could be one of our follow-ups, along with like, do you want your information shared? It's who wants to keep working on that. And we had looked, I think the next parallel SARE application is next April. And that could definitely be something, like that's enough time that we could think about building that up.
Yeah.
I think what we probably in the meantime is we can, like, as we put the recordings we have together and pull some highlights, is to say like, here's the information we have, and maybe we could collectively do a little bit of like, here's what still feels missing. Because I know I keep thinking, I followed up, I think one of the conversations that came up last time was renewing the countryside still doing interviews, because like the model that Verna Cragness is working on seems a lot like what some people have been talking about like co-ops, but or not co-ops, but condos. Something that came up on the listserv this week was this idea of like Chuck Andrus was saying, what if instead of incubators where the farmers had to move out, what if the incubator moved every few years and like the people who are there stayed on the land and the incubator, and that does seem lovely as ideas. And I do think that's a bit like what Verna's project is doing and turning the land over to the farmers. So cool. That seems like a good piece that we can keep working on. I'm in for that.
Yeah, I think one of the big takeaways why we backed away from that written resource idea was we initially were going to focus on models and realized through this series that models are so messy and that so many of these examples are taking bits and pieces from all sorts of different models. And so we decided to more focus on sort of these strategies and do some co-learning around that. I think the cooperative model maybe being slightly an exception in that there is a little bit more of a established structure there, which is really great. But even that, I'm sure, is borrowing ideas from other spaces too, depending on the case. So yeah, I think the case study type of approach might be really effective. But yeah, to echo Valentine, definitely staying in touch about sort of, there's a smaller, more focused group that wants to carry some of that kind of written resource forward. That would, we can definitely look towards funding for that. Colleen?
Yeah, I was gonna say with Agrarian Trust, I'm working on 10 case studies. Hopefully, it might be ambitious, around different approaches to secure land tenure. And so I'm happy to share once that's ready or collaborate on them. I'm in the very early stages right now, so I haven't even identified, but just refining like what questions to ask and things like that, and working with our partners. So it's like very, very early stages, but hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have like flushed out. And yeah, I'm happy to stay in touch and loop everyone in and share out whatever we find. But as you mentioned, I think the strategies will also be important, and there's just so many different legal restrictions in different places, so doing it nationally what works in one place won't work in another. So yeah, case studies, I agree, it's really helpful and beneficial, and hopefully we can cross exchange.
Awesome, Colleen. Yeah, I'm seeing some enthusiasm for that in the chat and would definitely echo that. And I'll propose that I'll put this in the follow-up, but I'm happy to sort of be a clearinghouse for now for resources that people want to, point my direction that I can send out to the group. That's great.
Thank you, Katie. And I love that there's more potential collaborators on that resource, whatever resource guide, strategy guide, whatever. I wonder if there could be some overarching themes and stories and case studies, but then also maybe some localized nitty-gritty stuff that has more to do with the state or localities of where we're all from. Just thinking out loud, but that's wonderful.
And thank you, Katie K, for putting, so the link that Katie just put in the chat was also kind of as far as we got what we had, kind of a table of some of those different approaches. So Colleen, especially if you haven't seen this might be a useful cross-reference. I also just want to kind of plant the seed. I'm not sure if anybody's here who's working with Savannah Institute, but like I can imagine as we continue this work, that a nice thing to keep our eyes out for is some of the places where there might be resources coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act. Like, for example, I feel like one of the things I've seen in common that we don't often talk about it is a lot of our efforts incorporate some component of agroforestry, and that there's so much like kind of money coming into that, but that those are often efforts that are more legible to people than farming as something that goes across property boundaries or that is done, you know, collaboratively, because the scale of forests is more legible to people as having like a lot of different stewards in a way that somehow like farming has been so captured by this imagination of single family farms. So great. Well, I realize we are getting to the end of our time together, but thank you so much, everyone. This has been such an enriching like year and a half of conversations about this, and I'm excited to hear all these different ways the work will continue. So we will keep talking about these things, but you can reclaim your Tuesday lunchtimes. And thank you, Katie D, for jumping in and helping to kind of bring these two groups together, and everybody else for being part of this.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much, everyone. We appreciate you being part of this and look forward to staying in touch and being in collaboration with all of you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks
Appreciate it.
to Mariah, who's been.
Thanks, everyone. It's been
Okay.
awesome.
See you at various field days.